Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member, where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Catherine Wynne. Catherine is a reader in Victorian and early 20th century literature and visual cultures at the University of Hull. She specialises in war art, colonialism and empire. She wrote the first biography of Lady Butler, war artist and traveller, 1846 to 1933. She has also just published the second edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes with Oxford's World Classics. Today, Catherine will explore the life and career of Elizabeth Thompson Butler, also known as Lady Butler. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audience, you can post questions in the chat bar, and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us as we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that being said, I'm now going to hand over to Catherine. I hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Amy and to the wonderful team here at the National Army Museum. This is my third invitation to the National Army Museum and it's an absolute privilege to be here. I expect everyone in the room at this stage has seen the exhibition. If not, you're in for an absolute treat upstairs. So I wrote a book on Lady Butler from the perspective of a travelling writer. Travelling artist. She's an artist who travels through historical time because she does the Napoleonic Wars. She does the Crimea 20 years after the end of the Crimean War. She's not as well known for her contemporary works, but she's also travelled in person. She married an officer in the British Army, which necessitated travel, places like Dover and Devonport, not that far away from us, but also he had the command of British forces in Alexandria between 1890 and 1893. She was in South Africa just before the Second Anglo-Boer War, and she also travelled to Ireland on her honeymoon. Her husband was, in fact, born in Ireland. But they're the types of travels that we're thinking about. More specifically today, though, I start with this, what she expresses, her ideology in her painting, really, and it comes from her paraphrasing really of Wellington after Waterloo, where she says her interpretation of what Wellington says is not a direct quote: "Nothing is sadder than a victory except a defeat." And that really sums up Lady Butler in what she's trying to achieve in her art. And today we'll be looking at some of her artwork, specifically the artwork that you will see that's exhibited here upstairs on the second floor. And what I want to draw out really is some of the stories and the makings of that art, some of the travels that went into the making of that art as well. And also I want to bring you back to the beginning of her life and where it all started. So I want to fill in some of the biographical detail. Lady Butler is fundamentally a storyteller. That's what she does in her art, and that's why she's a wonderful artist to look at again, because the multiplicity of stories that you can get, and it's always stories about the individual as well. And this is how she became famous, because she was interested in the individual soldier. So with that, I will start. She becomes the soldier's painter, and that's very much the singular, the soldier, the individual that she's thinking about. And this wonderful self-portrait from 1866. You can see it upstairs and much better. It's very difficult doing a PowerPoint when you've got the beautiful paintings upstairs, but we'll press on from 1866. But I'm going to start with 1914. And I'm going to start with the 9th of April 1914 because it's several months before the start of the First World War. If you bring that back in time, of course, no one really knew what was going to happen a few months later, although there was a sense of what was going to happen. But bringing it back to 1914, I think, is often chilling, because what were people doing in 1914? What was she thinking of as an artist? And an artist who is famous for her Waterloos and for her Napoleonic campaigns as well, for her Peninsular Wars. This is what she was famous for, and this is what was going to be a big moment for her in 1915. In 1915, she was painting and preparing for an exhibition at the Leicester Galleries. And she's writing to her sister, the poet and journalist Alice Meynell, whom we'll hear a little bit about en route today as well, because she's very important to Elizabeth's life. And she's talking about her Waterloos grow slowly. But the other thing we learn from this as well, from Butler here, is that the amount of work she did before she produced, a lot of the historical research she did. So they're very much historically grounded paintings. She read extensively about the Crimean War because there was a multi-volume publication on the Crimean War, which was still publishing into the 1870s, and that's where she got a lot of her information about the Crimean War. But so books published at the time, not long out of print. But the other thing we learn from this is the mental distress when she was wading through this, and she was trying to find subjects to avoid the horrors of the battle, subjects that she believed were fit to be painted. Now this causes her a problem because art changes, post-war, and because she is adamant that she won't paint the horrors of war if she can avoid it, she comes out of favour. And so that's something we'll trace today as well. So this is what she was preparing for. And this is the next slide is from the wonderful newspaper archives that we've access to now, which is it's fantastic if we can dig into an awful lot of that. And this is Waterford. She's living in Ireland at this time, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later. And the Evening News from Waterford said that she was making arrangements for her exhibition in support of the Officers' Families Fund. So something has changed. Obviously something has changed. We're now in the throes of war, and she is preparing. She does 2 exhibitions during the war, and they are for, the first one is for the Officers' Families Fund. And the painting, which still has widespread appeal and has widespread appeal today still, because often if we see Lady Butler, we'll see her name associated with Scotland forever. That's the one that's in the Leeds Gallery that you'll see on a multiple range of books. It's on my book as well. It's not my favourite painting by any means. I would rather have had your painting, Wendy, on it. Your painting is in the Tate? Is the remnants of an army. That's what I would prefer to have on the cover. But Scotland Forever has that sort of quality of, we associate it with Lady Butler. Very popular still in 1915. It was lent by Leeds, and also she had painted another painting for it, another Waterloo scene as well. So that's 1914, 1915, because so much of what we're thinking about today is going to be around that fantastic painting upstairs, The Dawn of Waterloo. So I wanted to bring you to that sort of moment in history and to capture what she's doing in 1914 and 1915. Let's bring her back to her birth, though. I always like doing the birth. I've talked about the birth before. So her mother was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. She was called Christiana Thompson. And Christiana Thompson kept a journal. And Christiana Thompson notes in her journal that her divine Lolly, she was then called Lolly, as you'll know from upstairs, if you look at the painting, the self-portrait upstairs, she becomes to be known as by the name Mimi, and that's the name that she carries on to the end of her life, Mimi. But she was Lolly at this point in the morning, and she was often called Babe by her mother. She called both her daughters Babes a lot. 13 and a half, the precision, past 2 in the morning. She was born in Lausanne. Now, this is where she does a lot of travelling even before she's born, poor Lady Butler, because her family had moved they were friends of Dickens. And on their honeymoon, their 10-month-long honeymoon, they had followed Dickens's footsteps in Italy. And then Dickens was in Lausanne, where he was writing. He was in the early stages of writing Dombey and Son. Many people are familiar with Dombey and Son. Great. Dombey and Son. He was writing the early stages of Dombey and Son. So if you're not familiar with Dombey and Son, what happens at Dombey and Son is that there is the loss of the mother in childbirth. And of course, poor Paul Dombey dies very young. So poor Christiana Thompson was listening to the opening chapters of Dombey and Son while she was going to give birth quite imminently as well. So that actually just struck me when I was preparing for this. I'd never thought of that particular thing before. So in her journal, she records this. So the first person first significant person to congratulate Thomas Thompson on the birth of his daughter is Dickens. Hearty and cordial congratulations. I am glad it is well over, unlike poor Mrs. Dombey. And this is important, not just because the family have a connection with Dickens, it is because, I would argue, she is the Dickensian painter. She is the painter that gets the detail, that she tells the story. She's very much a Victorian in that sense, but a great Victorian in the way that Dickens tells stories. It's about the individual, it's about the story, it's about Oliver Twist, and however you want to read it, we know who Oliver Twist is, all of us, even if we haven't read the book. I'm sure everybody in the audience has, but we know who Oliver Twist is because he's iconic. But that idea of the individual and the drama that we get in Lady Butler's paintings is very much within that kind of spirit of the Victorian storyteller. Now, she was self-taught. The family were wealthy enough not to have to work for a living. The family wealth on the Thompson side came from Jamaica and from plantations in Jamaica. He didn't work, but he didn't have an excessive amount of money. What they had was sort of a cultural power. They didn't have an excessive amount of money, which meant that they had to reside, very difficult for them, on the Italian Riviera for parts of the year. And then they used to come back to the English countryside of southern England as well. So she had that kind of dual sort of kind of heritage in a way. She had the sort of the Italian, she learned the Genoese dialect, and also she had periods in the English countryside as well. He taught his children. Now, what's interesting here is this is that she, and I know this from Christiana's diaries. Christiana was an amateur painter. She painted every day. She was also a gifted pianist. She wasn't a very good painter, but she had her daughters painting every single day. So her diary is populated with painting. So Elizabeth paints, and he does lessons for her, reading aloud so she can continue her artwork. And her mother, and this is from Eileen Gormanston, her youngest daughter, Elizabeth's youngest daughter, Christiana taught Elizabeth what landscape painting and watercolour ought to be. And Elizabeth came to love this medium. And wherever her travel-filled life later brought her, my mother sketched. But it started, and I was really interested in child development at that stage, because I had a young child myself when I started the book. And it's a really interesting study, I think, in child development. They were sketching, they were doing, they weren't trying to make them, achieve things, but they were always playing with art, and his philosophy of education was a little bit every day, except when they were traveling. So that's the way he taught. What does Italy also bring her? So she doesn't come from a military family, which is unusual, and she doesn't come from a family of artists. Many of the Victorian artists female artists that we're aware of or know of, come often from that sort of kind of family tradition of art. She comes from neither a military background nor an art background. But she becomes influenced by this, the periods of this period in Italy, where Garibaldi becomes this romantic figure. And in 1860, she records in one of her diaries that she wore a white Garibaldi. That was the Garibaldi kind of blouse, sort of in honour of her hero. So he becomes a hero. He's romantic. He's iconic. And this was a period in which she becomes increasing attention in her sketchbooks to military subjects. And where military subjects come to the forefront of the teenage artist's mind. And in 1860, she's then 14. Her mother records that Mimi and Babe, that's Alice, had seen Garibaldi, Mimi, 3 times when they were residing on the Italian Riviera as well. So they saw him make a late night flit on a boat. So that's where some of the influence comes from. The other part of the influence comes from 1870 and the Franco-Prussian War. So her first painting that she exhibited at the Royal Academy, which is missing today, was also called Missing. and she actually used, her father was a subject for this painting as well. He sat for the painting as well, and it's about two kind of wearied soldiers coming back from a Franco-Prussian campaign. So that was really, really, really important. And the other great influence, of course, are the French war artists, the inspiration from the French war artists who were beginning to think about painting military subjects and wars differently as well. So that's where the influence comes from. She's trained in the South Kensington schools. She's dissatisfied with a lot of the art training, and a lot of the art training was excluded to her. The Royal Academy training, because she was a woman, was excluded to her. So she goes across to Italy so she can finish her sort of art training in Italy, in Florence. She got fed up of her parents because they were always moving around. And at one point, she chastises them in the letter and says, I need you to settle down. I need to be able to be in a settled place where I can do my art. So she was very forthright. So they settle in the Isle of Wight. And they settle in the Ventnor area of the Isle of Wight. And they rent a house called the Dell, which you can still see today in the Isle of Wight. And that's where she started. In a studio in Ventnor, she started her famous painting, The Roll Call. So the sketches for that took place in the Isle of Wight. Then she transferred it to a studio in London and completed it there for the Royal Academy exhibition of 1874. So this was the picture that set all England talking. And you cannot overestimate what the roll call did. And I think you have to spend time with the painting upstairs. And it's a real privilege to have it here. It's in the Royal Collection. It's in the Royal Collection because Queen Victoria wanted it. And of course, the Queen, the sovereign, was going to get it. But she got it from the Manchester industrialist, a man called Galloway, had commissioned Elizabeth to do this painting. And of course, he handed it over, naturally enough, to the Queen, as you would expect. But it's the picture that set all England talking. She is and becomes a celebrity. She's a very fine artist. Celebrity is a problematic word today. It often isn't associated necessarily with hard work and brilliance. She was brilliant, hardworking, and a celebrity. I didn't say that. So, what she's doing here that stuns the other painters. Millais becomes an early influence for her, John Everett Millais. But he was, of course, a lot older than she was, but she had gone to him for painting advice. So when it's brought to the Royal Academy to be exhibited, she had the artists gathering around her, and she talks about having Millais go through each of these men one by one, and he was asking her detailed questions about it as well, the painting. What does she do that is unique? Okay, there's a question for the audience. I didn't say at the beginning that I'd ask a question, did I? What do you think she does that's unique? Yes. Yes. Perfect. Thank you very much. It's the focus on the ordinary soldier. She doesn't represent the officers. And that's why she becomes the soldier's painter. So she's loved by the army. And she's also, of course, highly regarded by Victoria as well. So she gets critical acclaim and she also gets public acclaim because it's the ordinary soldier. And what she does very beautifully is she captures, long before we have an understanding of trauma, really, not till the late 19th century, she brings forth in her art the she doesn't have that, she'll not use the word trauma. She won't use that particular word. That doesn't mean they can't express it. But she's able to bring forth how each of these soldiers is experiencing the conflict, how each of them is experiencing the aftermath of battle differently. Now, this is based on no particular Crimean battle specifically, like some of her other artists, but she does three great Crimean paintings, and this is the first one and the most significant one. So I'm just going to go into it in a little bit more detail because it's quite hard to see there. And the detail, I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail if I can with this. Again, you need to go upstairs to do this. So he's calling the roll. So obviously the roll call is for those who are, the people who don't shout out their names are missing, gone, absent from it. But if you look at this, if you go upstairs and look at this painting, each one of these men is experiencing this aftermath differently. this young man is dead here. But what is really interesting about her art is it's full of drama in a very positive sense. It's full of gesture and movement. And if you just look at hands, if you just focus in on hands and what hands are doing in this particular painting, even of itself, is really, really interesting. So you've got this gesture. Now this man here, I hope we'll see him a little bit better later, but look at him upstairs. He's got a bushy beard. He's an older gentleman. He's probably only in his 30s, but he's hardened by battle. But he's clearly older than some of the others, if you see his face in detail upstairs. And he's reaching out, and his hand has got this sort of movement, this gesture towards this deeply kind of affected young man here. He's either in pain but he cannot look. He cannot look beyond his arm. But it's the gesture. It's the theatrical gesture in a way, but in a very sort of, but also, now I don't want to make a kind of a gendered comment really about this, but I think there's something too about gendering. I can in the same way as that you read somebody like Elizabeth Gaskell and how she writes about the poverty in Manchester very much with empathy, from that sort of perspective. And you see this with Butler, and Dickens does it as well. I'm just saying it's just an exclusively female thing, but there's something there, I think, about empathy, about touch, and that you see right through her paintings. It's almost the touch, the attempt to support that these men are expressing. Now, she would have known this because she got soldiers from the Crimean War 20 years before to pose for her. And when she became more famous after this, the army just came and they just posed for her all the time so she had access to stories. So what she was basing this on was not just about history, but it was the access to stories as well. This man is staring out over beyond the frame here. He's staring out. This man here, if you look at him in detail upstairs, he's utterly exhausted. He's exhausted by battle. But all of them have a different expression. All are individuals. There's blood here. He's rapping while this man here is in a state of some form of desperation, whether it's what we would say is psychological or physical. He's paying detailed attention to his wrist, and you can see the blood stain on the wrist. And always in a Lady Butler battle painting, you will see the debris of war. This is the untold story, the helmets, the debris of war. That's what she does as well. And they're the stories that are not told. The hands have veins. You can see the veins when you go upstairs and look at it in detail. The veins on the hands, the detail in the hands. She was a splendid painter of horses. Now, one of the artists that she looked up to when she was a very young girl in her teenage years was the French artist Rosa Bonheur, who became famous for her animal paintings. But she was very strident about it, and when she was asked whether she's going to be an animal painter, even though she had greatly admired her, she said, "I am not going to be an animal painter. I'm going to be something else." She wanted to be different, but her paintings of horses are also remarkable because what she does with the horses is that you can see the expression in the horses' faces. We have the privilege here of looking at her sketchbooks, and you see how much of the time she spent on sketching, and a lot of that was on horses. So when she was living at the Dell in Bonchurch, and of course this is a place they went to because Dickens is associated with Bonchurch as well, is when she was living there, they had a horse brought to the front door so she could sketch the horse every day. This is the type of work, not unusual for an artist, but she was very, very determined to look at it. And this is some of the ideas of what she talks about. She makes a little watercolour sketch very carefully of the attitude of the figures. I had none of the alterations to make in the course of my work, which was a waste of time. Each figure was drawn in first without the greatcoat, my models posing in a tight shell jacket so as to get the figure well drawn first. How easily then could the thick, less shapely greatcoat be painted on the well-secured foundation. No matter how its heavy folds, crossbelts, haversacks, water bottles and everything else broke the lines, they were there, safe and sound underneath. So she went to pawnbroker shops in London to get the uniforms, the correct uniforms, and her studio, of course, as you'd expect, was filled with uniforms. Her autobiography, written in 1922, is very interesting, but again, like all autobiographies, particularly of that period, it does hold back a lot of stuff. So this is what happens. So Christiana Thompson writes a letter to her stepdaughter, Thomas Thompson had married before, and his daughter stayed in Italy, and she writes a letter so they always have Italian family. She writes to her stepdaughter, and she from the Isle of Wight, and says, "Wondrous news from Mimi. She came home. The picture's in. She went up for varnishing day. Her picture was placed on the line. I don't have to tell you what that is, but obviously at eye level so people can see it. She had been skied, for missing, had been skied. And had a series of trumps from the RAs. On the following Friday, she went by invitation to the private view, and there was a series of bewildering trumps awaited her, as can be told. At the same time, they never gave her academy status. So when she went for that in a couple of years later, she was outvoted by Herkimer, and she never went again for it. So while they were really, a lot of people do work around that exclusion, celebration, but also exclusion of her as well in this sort of privileged Royal Academy circle. But her fame, there's probably jealousy too. The fame is incredible here at this point. So if we just think about then, that's the fame, and I don't want to, there are reams of newspaper columns on her in the 1870s, and their interpretation of it, we can all interpret it ourselves, because that's the beauty of her art. You can see something different and tell a story from going upstairs and looking at that painting. The mounted field officer, you've got so different languages the Victorians have. The men who are battle-hardened, veteran to the boy recruit. Some bind up their wounds not severe enough to take them to the rear. One who has miscalculated strength, or whose death wound has been concealed or overlooked, has fallen in his place and lies prone dead in a swoon. A raw young soldier is overcome by the shock of this sudden fall. That's how they interpret it. We can all interpret it any way we want to, because it's there for us to read. It's basically a book in another sense, and leans his face on his musket, all but fainting. Here's the young man that I pointed out, where the other older soldiers reaching out to sort of touch him on the head. Right, what we know of the roll call as well, and it's pretty much is that they were queues for it, the roll call, and by before half of the year of 1874 was out, 250,000 of the artist's photographs had been sold by one photographer alone. And she said she only realised in her autobiography that she was famous when she saw a picture of herself on a costermonger's barrow on the streets. So that was that's. So, and of course, they had to put a policeman in front of the painting to avoid the surging crowd. So we've got loads of accounts of that people were queued for this. So this is real celebrity status. But she can cut through, somebody who can cut through with the critics and cut through with the public as well. And that's a rare achievement. So, and these are some of her sketches, and then you've got some of this, this press stuff that you can find online, through the sort of British Library and the various resources there. You can find, again, much press coverage from the Times to these, to the 19th century art journals. And remember, this is a great period to also be an artist in, because you've got the rise of this sort of the illustrated press. She illustrated for the Graphic as well. So some of her early work was in the Graphic, and she continued to do some of that up into certainly through her career, even though she's not maybe known as well for that, she does that, but also because it's the rise of a more literate culture as well, and the rise of the sort of the journals and the newspaper industry. Of course, by the 1890s, we've got the Strand magazine. It's probably the one that we're most familiar with today, which is associated with Sherlock Holmes. I'm bringing you to this one very quickly because I love it. Nobody would like this probably except a few people like me, but I love this painting as well. So this is her second. I'm not going to dwell on this. I just want to re-emphasize some points there. This is her second balaclava painting. This is her second painting of the Crimean War, and her third one is in the Ferrans Art Gallery in Hull, which we're not going to look at. I love this one because this guy here and this guy here actually we're actually in the charge of the Light Brigade, both of them. This guy here is called Pennington. Now, Pennington went on to become an actor-manager, and he was, after the Crimean War, he was the actor-manager of Sadler's Wells Theatre, and he was Gladstone's favourite Hamlet. So So I think that's partially why. She was a bit annoyed by him. She thought he was being a bit too dramatic. So she was a bit, sort of exchange, oh gosh, would he just being too dramatic, just going over the edge here. But Loy is also very interesting. So Loy Smith. Loy Smith knew what he had experienced was really important. So he donated some of his, and you can find his jacket in Sheffield museums today, and some of his stuff from the Crimean War. But again, not to do it into any detail, I wanted to, because not the best. I'll get a better one than that for you to look at. This is photographs from a long time ago, so they're not great. But it's the eyes in the horse, the fear, the terror of what the horse has experienced. He's been under sort of a barrage of Russian guns. And this, again, the hands in this, the gesture. And it's very, it's this sort of, embracing of this young trumpeter who's dying. And again, that very sort of loving, caring sort of embrace that you can see going right through kind of her artwork again. And Pennington doing his Hamlet here as well, you can see. But the hands, the clasped fists as well. So this is a very interesting, for how you look at some of her work that she does on horses. But the men always assisting each other. And this is why this painting in particular is probably one of her more, I would say, sort of theatrical pieces as well. And that's when it's sort of, people don't like them because they sort of maybe that painting maybe verges too much on the sort of the Victorian melodrama, but I don't see it as that. I think melodrama is, I'm a great fan of Victorian melodrama, so that's probably, why. The expression of the sergeant calling out to his entranced and half-crazed comrade, that's Pennington. That of the non-commissioned officer carrying the dead trumpeter, and that of the seated soldier to the right, who was half sulkily, half ruefully looking at his shattered hand, are admirable, and in conception, in drawing, and execution, the central figure is absolutely perfect. And she talked about one woman who went to see the exhibition and burst out crying and had to be taken from, seeing that painting when it was exhibited, had to be taken from the room. I took that from the Sporting Gazette because I just want to show where she's cutting through. So this is her fame. So in 1877, she does Inkerman. She sends it off, the return from Inkerman, which is in the Ferns Art Gallery in Hull. She sends that off to be, and she marries this guy. So this changes her direction of travel. This is from a painting upstairs, a much later representation of, we'll talk about it maybe a bit later if I've got some time. But this is from a painting that she cut up that he didn't like. So William Francis Butler was a high-ranking officer when she met him. I think he was a major when she met him in the British Army, but he was also, of course, he was also from Ireland, and he had interesting sort of, I suppose, a very interesting figure. When she talks about him in her autobiography, she talks about him first as being a writer. He was a very well-regarded and well-renowned travel writer, because part of his work and his early part of his soldiering was actually in Canada, and he was partly responsible for establishing the mounted police in Canada as well. So a very, very interesting figure, well-written, and a pretty much accomplished travel writer when she meets him as well. Now, he was somebody, a soldier at that time in Britain, he was high-ranking. He was part of General Wolseley's gang or ring of very, very accomplished men, accomplished officers. But, while he was extending the empire, he was also very concerned about the extending of the empire. So he becomes that very interesting figure who has a very complicated relationship to the empire while he is part of the extension of empire at the same time. And he didn't like this particular painting, which has been destroyed, but she didn't want to destroy her husband. She kept that and Wolsey as well, who sat for her, because it was a painting commemorating the defeat of the Egyptian forces in 1882. Under their sort of nationalist leader, Colonel Arabi. And he said, this wasn't an army that was a real foe because they didn't have the equipment. I don't want to celebrate a war in which there is, they weren't an equal. They fought bravely and hard, but they didn't have the types of equipment that we had. So he didn't like that painting. And so she comes under sort of the influence of him. What he opens up to her, of course, which is really important for her as an artist, he opens up one landscape, which is Ireland, and the colours in Ireland really stimulated her in her art. But he also opens up, so they spent periods of time in Ireland, and she retires to Ireland and ends up in Gormanston Castle in County Meath, where she dies, where her daughter Eileen marries into the Gormanston family. And the Preston family, she gets, as I said, to South Africa. to Egypt. She's going down the Nile. He was on the rescue mission for Gordon in Khartoum. They didn't get there fast enough. But she goes down the Nile afterwards and spends time in Sudan as well. So that opens up a new vista to her as well. So if you wanted to buy something of Lady Butler, which you can still buy today, you can still buy her sketchbook and diary of her travels, including Egypt. And I would really, really recommend the original of that, not the print ones, the ones that you print on demand, but you can still buy it, and it's absolutely beautiful thing to possess. This one is the famous one, Scotland Forever. I'm just putting Scotland Forever there because it connects up to the next painting. And of course, if you read that on a face value, these are the Scots Greys, and it looks like a triumphalist, kind of battle picture. But in fact, it's the story behind the pictures that are really important for Butler. They're actually annihilated on the way back. A lot of them are annihilated. So even in that charging, wonderfully vivid painting full of movement, so if you have an opportunity, haven't seen that in Leeds, they are charging on you. But at the same time, behind that painting is their annihilation and as well. So you have to, with all of these paintings, I think you have to really look into kind of almost behind the canvas and hand. That's what I'm trying to do a little bit. The onrush of the horses is splendidly suggested without the theatrical excess that mars so many of the works of its kind. That was the review of it of the Leicester Galleries in 1915. The year of course, of Waterloo. And this is important as well. She had an innate talent for depicting movement. I think that's really important too to think about. Rorke's Drift is the one we're going to go on to now, because Rorke's Drift and Scotland Forever are interesting, because she's doing both of them at the same time. And she's preparing Scotland Forever for the Royal Academy. But the Queen says, I want you to paint Rorke's Drift for me. And of course, you drop what you're doing because the Queen has summoned you. So she goes to Victoria, and what she wants to paint actually is during the Anglo-Zulu Wars, the heir to the Napoleonic heir to the throne, Napoleon III's son, actually fought for the British. He was part of British forces, and he was killed in a skirmish in South Africa, and they brought his body home, and he was, he was their only son, and they were very friendly with the Empress Eugenie, and because William Butler was a Catholic, Elizabeth was a convert to Catholicism in the late 1860s. He was a Catholic. Eugenie asked him to bring the body of her son home. So that's how, that's the type of circles they were moving in as well. So he brought his body home, and that's what she wanted to paint, but that had already been done by a French artist. But that was the type of subject, and Victoria, who was very good friends with the Empress Eugenie, said it might be a bit of a sensitive subject also to paint that. But she didn't want to do Rorke's Drift, because it was against her principle. So this is the time where she has internal conflict because she doesn't do battles if she can avoid it. So the painting wasn't an incredible success because it's sort of when her vision itself was compromised. I suppose when you're asked to do something, it wasn't it's very difficult if it doesn't actually come from your own creative, where you want to go creatively. She's doing it out of this sort of, she isn't on, so even though she's got access to a lot of, travel, she doesn't have access the way some of the Victorian artists were. They would have been attached to newspapers as well. So even though she's a much better artist than many of them, she hasn't, as a woman, she can't travel to the battlefield as readily either. She goes in the wake of the army with her husband in a privileged capacity. So this Rorke's Drift, again, it is full of movement, and again you get the individual experience here. Again, the drink here, the drink that he's just clasping here, and while he's been shot. And she did have the regiment. They were back in, I think it was Portsmouth, where she had the regiment to actually use as subjects. And this is, you can't see anything here because it's very, you'll have to look at it upstairs. But the Zulus here, you can't really see them in this image. They're very much in the kind of the edge, in the edge of the canvas here. She doesn't have models. She's one model to work on. She doesn't have models to work on either. So, but it's meant to be, of course, and it is about. So it's very much a kind of it is an imperial painting, and it has come to attention more today because it is an imperial painting, and it has come under kind of a greater deal of scrutiny as an imperial painting. So Rorke's Drift, of course, was after the British forces under Lord Cheltenham had been defeated several hours earlier. They've been wiped out by a superior force. The Zulus were the Zulu armies who had been trained from the early part of the 19th century were very, even though they didn't have access to the type of weaponry that the British had access to, in terms of their strategy, it was incredibly, they had an incredible strategy, and they were incredibly successful on the battlefield against, kind of often these kind of larger and more militarily equipped forces. But so on the way back from that, that disastrous defeat for British forces under Chelmsford, news comes that there's this. It's not a garrison. It's just it's a sort of a hospital that they set up as sort of a post here. This sort of outpost. So it's not fortified in any way. That the Zulus were coming in their direction as well. So they hadn't time to flee. And there was no point fleeing. So they had to hold their ground. So they made their own sort of rough fortifications here, about 140 to 150 in this space here. Some of them were in the infirmary. The infirmary was burned down, and some of them escaped from the infirmary, but not very many. But they held off until, after about a 12-hour battle, the Zulu forces retreated. So she wanted, because of the extraordinary defeat that had happened earlier in the day, they wanted to celebrate this as an extraordinary moment, and it has become famous for today. I think there's something like 11 or 12 Victoria Crosses for this, and these are the two central figures who commanded here, and they posed for her as well. But this is a painting that she found conflicted with her vision, because she did not want to paint a battle, and that's probably why it's not a great painting, because you see the battle only at the edges of this. But what you get here again is the debris of war. With the Scotland Forever, the enemy was not shown, but the proposed imperial subject would show British soldiers at grips with the foe. That was her own words, at grips with the foe. She does not want to do it. Now, William Butler, I said, he's sort of an anti-imperialist who is an imperialist. So a very conflicted figure. And this is what he says. He didn't like the takeover of southern Africa, or what was happening in southern Africa. He said, it does not matter much whether Black King has crossed into our river or our territory in an attempted rectification of some wrong which he has suffered at our hands, or whether we have crossed the river into his territory upon the clearest and most conclusive testimony that his property and that of his subjects would be vastly benefited by being transferred to our hands. A bit scary, that language today. So I just thought that was an interesting one. We would be vastly benefited by being transferred to our hands. So again, those discussions, discussions about empire are still very relevant to us today, and about the takeover of land. And again, capturing that sort of intimate moment in battle as well. The sip of water, which has dire consequences. You can see that a little bit better, and of course you can see it upstairs as well. So I wanted to capture them. So it was the 24th Regiment at Portsmouth, and they recreated the battle so she could, as nearly to life as possible, but from the private soldier's viewpoint as well. So this is the one that is the most. I do realise I'll have to hurry up a bit. This is the one which is magnificent upstairs. And when I was working on Butler's the book, of course, it wasn't available. So it's a real pleasure to be able to see it. Just some background context to this. She made her studies in twilight at home in Delgany, County Wicklow. That's where they were living there, all out of doors. So take this to when you're going upstairs to have a look at it again. Not a thing painted in the studio. I pressed many people into my service as models, and I think I got the light on their fine Irish faces true to nature. Of course, a lot of the Irish were in the British Army as well. She even got an Irish dragoon home on leave in the village, whose splendid profile she realised would be very telling. So it's in twilight. she's done most of this out of doors, and you can see that. She also visits Waterloo as a teenager, and she managed to find a veteran of Waterloo. And she said, what a story he was telling us with the scenes of that story before our eyes. And she was an eagerness to learn from the lips of one who took part in the fight as well. So she had been to the battlefield of Waterloo and had at least the experience of someone who had experienced the conflict when she was a teenager. Eileen Gormanston, her daughter, describes she was so involved in painting the Dawn of Waterloo that on one occasion her young model, who was required to lie in position for so long on the ground after sunset, you can see him there, he woke up, he fell asleep and woke up with a cold. So that was her, and this is not the representation that you see upstairs. It's an older version of the, so it was done outside at twilight with a great variety of types in it. When she moved to Aldershot, where her husband had the command at Aldershot, she got the old court martial hut, and she had 4 skylights put into it so she could get the colour and the light. See, she could command the army in lots of ways, which was great. And because they wanted to do it for her, they had great respect for her because she was telling their story, or trying to tell their story. And this guy was her tutor for her grandchild. And I think this is interesting because he was a tutor of her grandchild, so he knew her when she was, in the later stages of her career. Dawn is just breaking a pearly light on a subtle quality steals over the horizon, suffusing the form of the soldier awaking from the sleep. The longer one gazes at the brighter appears to become the light, growing more brilliant with each second. The effect is to make the scene intensely alive. One almost expects to hear the silvery notes of the camp as it's sort of coming into kind of light. So the silveriness, the quality of light, the subtlety of that. And of course, he saw that because it was actually in Gormanston Castle. But again, the touch, the gesture, the soldiers at different parts of this young man is exhausted. We know from Waterloo it was very wet the night before. They were drenched. You will all know more about Waterloo than I will, so I won't go into any great. I just want you to think about the gesture, and all of them in different, all of them are experiencing this wake-up call in different states of alertness. He's looking out here from under his covering there, and the dying embers of the fire as they wake up on the morning of Waterloo, in which many of these Scots Greys, and of course this is the connection between the Scots Greys and the Scots Greys you saw charging earlier. You're talking about the same regiment as well, and that's what they experienced later. So it is a magnificent painting. The clasped hand as he's asleep on the ground. This is probably the poor young man who ended up with a very bad cold because she made him lie like that on the ground for too long. I just like this, going back. So I just want to say a couple of things as I sort of, can I 4 more minutes as I finish up? Is that okay? Thank you. So a reputation source, she's finding it really difficult to manage sort of the late Victorian imperialism because she belongs to the earlier age of the soldier. But it would do her a massive disservice to say that she's not relevant in 1914. And this, I think, comes from the experience of John Glubb. Now, I gave this talk in Whitby, and actually it was wonderful because one of the organisers of the talk said, actually, John Glubb had come to her school when she was young and given a talk. But this next painting I'm going to show you is when in 1916, he put this painting of Steady the Drums and Fifes into over in his tiny hut in 1916. While he was in the middle of war, because actually it spoke to him. And this Victorian painting from 1897 spoke to him. And I just want to do this one. I'm not going to talk about it in any great detail, but again, see, these are the young, young musicians, the young drummer boys, and playing the Steady the Fifes and Drums. Very famous moment in this particular battle as well. But all of them are in. Again, how she captures the child's or the young teenagers, the experience sort of the battlefield as well, the clasped hand of the comrade who's fallen, clasping his leg there, and they're sort of in different states of often, was described often of excitement. We wouldn't see it, how they interpret excitement would be different how we interpret, but they're using the word excitement, and this boy his hand is pressed on this young boy's head. And you'll see this upstairs if you look into the corners of the painting. You see the next one, you'll see often this is how she, so if you go and look at Rorke's Drift again, if you haven't noticed this, it's the EB. It's the EB you'll see upstairs on Rorke's Drift. She was ET before her marriage. She then becomes Elizabeth Butler. He's knighted for his services, his military services, William Butler, and she becomes Lady Butler because of his knighthood. So so this is how it's interpreted, but again, the writhing death of the boy whose hand clings round a comrade's ankle. Again, the Victorians, or the people who were looking at these paintings, told stories. Now, I'm going to end now in a moment, and I just want to go back to Eileen Gormanston, because I started with this idea of her just being born at 2. And what did her daughter think? To me as a child, and doubtless also to my elder sister and brothers, it had been quite natural that mothers should paint 6-foot canvases for each year's academy, that when I hurtled down to the studio to announce the waiting meal, the air surrounding his mother should be a delicious mixture of lavender oil and paint. So whenever she gets this whiff of lavender oil, she thinks of her mother, small and slight, with delicate face and strong hands. She's a worker in art. Her hands are strong. And this is what is conjured up for her. Eileen had a lot of health problems, and she recalls a lovely moment, and that you can still buy that online, a little kept, her book from the 1950s, and she said she used to bring Eileen into the garden and say, "Smell a flower." And that was her sort of way to sort of help her daughter. And she got that from her mother, Christiana Thompson, who was very creative. And I'm finally going to end in this. I didn't use this one in the book. I found it later. And it was just about how she makes art from what she sees in her stories. So in 1916, because we started in the war, or just before the war in 1914, she writes a letter to Alice, who's been a remarkable help to her all her life, Alice. "I saw a large batch of wounded arrive at Charing Cross yesterday, a pitiful sight. Yet the sitting up ones were laughing and shaking hands with the crowd. Those on the stretchers could hardly be seen in the twilight of the ambulances, but I saw their arms waving as I tried to catch the flowers the women threw in. One poor fellow who could only move one foot shook it at the people in acknowledgement of their cheers. All were pale in their bandages." Now, if you ever find that painting, because I'm sure she painted it, let me know. I'd love to see that. So, the book I did was Lady Butler, War Artist and Traveller, and she didn't go to Afghanistan, but she painted Afghanistan. It's in the Tate, a remarkable painting. But she did go to South Africa and the south of England, Italian Riviera, and these Alexandria, and also Dinan in France as well. So thank you very much. And sorry for going over by 7 minutes.